In the winter of 1947, an old man stood on a hilltop in California and looked down at the ocean for what he did not know would be the last time. Behind him sat a house with 165 rooms, 2 swimming pools built to look like Roman ruins, a private zoo, and enough Spanish ceilings and Italian marble to fill a small nation's museums. He had spent 28 years building it. He had never finished it. Now, a doctor was telling him his heart could not survive another winter at this altitude, this far from a hospital, and so he was leaving for what he believed would be a few months to recover somewhere safer. He never came back. 4 years later, he was dead in a house that was not his own, more than 200 miles from the castle that carried his name. His name was William Randolph Hearst, and at the height of his power, 1 out of every 4 American newspaper readers read something he had printed. He was, by some measures, the most powerful private citizen in the history of the country, a man who could make or break presidents with a single editorial decision. And 10 years before he left that hilltop for the last time, a court had already taken his empire out of his hands. Not his heirs, not a rival, a court, and the men his own bankers appointed to run his life for him. This is a story about a man who never split his fortune among children, never lost a boardroom fight to a brother, never watched a will get contested in a courtroom by people who hated each other. William Randolph Hearst did something rarer and in its own way, stranger. He nearly destroyed the greatest fortune in American media all by himself, with no one's help at all, simply by refusing to stop. Ask yourself something before we go further. If you built the machine yourself, ran it yourself, controlled every lever of it yourself, could you still lose it? Hold that thought, because everything you think you know about how great fortunes collapse is about to be tested by a man who broke every rule of the pattern and still ended up on his knees in front of his own creditors. To understand how a man this powerful nearly lost everything without a single relative to blame, you have to go back to where the money started, because unlike so many of these stories, it did not start with William at all. It started with his father, George Hearst, a rough, half-literate prospector from Missouri who went west during the gold rush and, through a combination of nerve and blind luck, ended up holding stakes in some of the richest mines in American history: the Comstock Lode in Nevada, the Anaconda Copper Mine in Montana, the Homestake Gold Mine in South Dakota. George Hearst was the machine. Silver, gold, copper, pulled directly out of the ground and converted into one of the great fortunes of the Gilded Age. He eventually became a United States Senator, and when he died in 1891, most of that fortune passed not to William, but to his wife, Phoebe. It was Phoebe Hearst who held the purse strings for the next 3 decades, funding libraries and universities, and it was Phoebe who, in 1919, finally died and left her only son the full weight of the family fortune. William Randolph Hearst was 56 years old, and for the first time in his life, there was no parent left to say no. By then, William had already built something of his own, a newspaper empire that started with a single paper his father had taken as payment for a gambling debt, the San Francisco Examiner. William turned it into a sensation, and then did it again in New York, and then again in city after city, buying and building newspapers with a formula of scandal, spectacle, and outrage that the more sober papers of the era sneered at and could not outsell. By the 1920s, he had newspapers in nearly every major American city, then magazines, then radio stations, then a film studio in Hollywood to produce movies starring the actress who would become his lifelong companion, Marion Davies. This was the real machine, the actual money printer, an empire of ink and airwaves that reached into more American households than any single voice before or since. At its peak in the mid-1930s, Hearst owned 28 major newspapers and 18 magazines, along with radio stations, wire services, and a movie studio, an empire worth something close to $200 million, an almost unimaginable sum for a media company at the time. He had built, with his own hands and his own instincts, one of the great cash-generating machines in the history of American business. And then, the same year he inherited his mother's fortune, he began building something that would generate nothing at all. In 1919, on a hilltop above the family's old cattle ranch on the central California coast, Hearst hired a young architect named Julia Morgan and told her, in effect, that money was not a consideration. He wanted a house that could compete with the palaces he had toured as a boy in Europe. And over the next 28 years, that is exactly what she built him. They called it La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill, though the world would simply call it Hearst Castle. It grew to 165 rooms across more than 60,000 square feet, filled with Spanish ceilings shipped whole across the ocean, Roman sarcophagi, Egyptian antiquities, medieval tapestries, and an indoor pool lined floor to ceiling in gold leaf tile. It cost something on the order of $37 million to build in the money of the era, and that number does not include what filled it, because the castle was never really the point. The point was what Hearst put inside it. He had, by the 1930s, assembled what was likely the largest private art collection any individual had ever put together. Tens of millions of dollars in paintings, antiques, and entire European rooms bought wholesale and shipped home in pieces, so much of it that even 6 separate residences could not hold it all. He kept a 5-story warehouse in the Bronx just to store the overflow. If you have heard the phrase, he bought whole castles and shipped them to America, in Hearst's case, it was not a figure of speech. He genuinely did that more than once. Here is the part that separates Hearst's story from almost every other one you have heard. He never split this fortune with anyone. There were no siblings fighting over shares, no dozens of heirs cutting the pie into smaller and smaller pieces. He controlled it all personally as one man with total authority over every newspaper, every radio license, every dollar, and he still nearly lost it because a fortune does not need other people to destroy it. It only needs one person who refuses to believe the money will ever run out. Because Hearst never stopped spending, not even for a single year, not even as the country around him fell apart. His personal spending alone, at its peak, ran to something like $15 million a year, a figure that had nothing to do with running his newspapers and everything to do with feeding the castle and the collection. And when the stock market collapsed in 1929 and the Great Depression settled over the country, advertising revenue at his newspapers, the actual engine of the whole empire, began to dry up. Circulation held, profits did not. And here is the mechanism worth sitting with because it is different from the usual story of a fortune dying. Hearst was not dividing a machine among heirs who let it rust. He was still running the machine himself every day with his hands on every lever. What he would not do, could not bring himself to do, was stop building the thing that only cost. He refused to sell a single property. He refused to cut a single employee's salary. He kept buying art through the depths of the Depression, as though the crash happening outside his gates simply did not apply to him. A machine and a white elephant were both operating out of the same set of hands, and the man holding those hands would not let go of either one. By 1935, his combined holding companies carried an estimated $126 million in debt, and that figure kept climbing. And in 1937, the number caught up with him. Reporting at the time put his personal debt north of $95 million, a sum that in today's money would sit well over $1 billion. And Hearst's bankers ran out of patience. His creditors forced his corporations into a court-ordered reorganization. A trustee was appointed to take control of Hearst's own finances out of Hearst's own hands. His salary was slashed to a fraction of what it had been. His annual dividend was stopped outright. Newspapers he had spent decades building were sold off or folded into rivals. Property across the country was liquidated piece by piece. He mortgaged the castle itself for a fraction of what it had cost to build. He sold the animals from his private zoo to the Los Angeles Zoo. One by one, the lions and the elephants that had once wandered the hills above his swimming pool now living out their lives behind public fences. And in the middle of it all, he sent a single instruction north to Julia Morgan, the architect who had spent 18 years bringing his dream to life. Stop work entirely at San Simeon. The castle that was never finished would now, quite simply, never be finished at all. Here's the moment that matters most in this whole story. More than the mortgage, more than the zoo animals, more than any single number on a balance sheet. William Randolph Hearst, the man who had built one of the largest media empires on earth with his own hands, who had never split his authority with a sibling or a partner or a board he could not control, woke up one morning in 1937 to discover that strangers now decided what he could and could not spend. The machine was still his name. It was no longer his hand on the wheel. By 1940, he had lost personal control of the entire communications empire he had spent 50 years building. He kept the title, He kept the house. What he no longer had was the authority that made either one mean anything. This is the part of the story every version of this pattern eventually arrives at, whether the fortune belongs to one man or 100 heirs. The moment a business stops answering to the person who built it and starts answering instead to the people it owes money to, the family's role quietly changes from owner to tenant. Hearst had spent his whole adult life believing that because he controlled every share, because there was no one to split the inheritance with, he was immune to the trap that swallowed families like the Vanderbilts. He was not immune. He had simply built a different door into the same room. Ownership without discipline collapses just as fast as ownership divided among careless heirs. The mechanism looks different from the outside. A courtroom instead of a will, a trustee instead of a scattered family, but underneath it is the same quiet arithmetic. Money that only leaves a machine and never returns to it will eventually stop the machine from running at all. But here is where Hearst's story bends away from the others, and it is worth sitting with because it is the one piece of good news buried inside all this wreckage. Marion Davies, the actress who had shared his life for more than 30 years, stepped in during the worst of it and reportedly handed over more than $1 million of her own money and jewelry to help keep him afloat, an act of loyalty that outlasted the very empire it was trying to save. And the reorganization itself, brutal as it was, did something the Vanderbilts and the Posts never managed. It kept the machine alive. The trustees who took Hearst's authority away in 1937 were not trying to destroy his company. They were trying to save it from him. And in a strange, humbling way, they succeeded. Costs were cut, debts were restructured, newspapers that could not survive were closed, and the ones that could were kept running on a real budget for the first time in decades. Hearst never fully regained personal control in his own lifetime, but the company itself, forced into discipline it would never have chosen for itself, survived the Depression, survived the war, and survived him. When he died in 1951, ownership passed not to a scattered pile of grandchildren fighting over shares, but into a corporate and trust structure his own advisors had built around the crisis of 1937, one designed specifically to prevent the fortune from ever again being hostage to a single person's refusal to stop spending. That structure held. The Hearst Corporation is still standing today, still privately held by the family's trust, one of the largest media and information companies in the world, worth many billions of dollars. Hearst did not save his empire by holding on tighter. He saved it without meaning to, by being forced to let go. And that is the real lesson sitting underneath the marble and the gold leaf on that hilltop. Every other fortune in this pattern falls apart because a family fragments a machine that a founder never protected with structure. Hearst's fortune nearly fell apart for the opposite reason. He never let anyone else near the wheel, and the wheel very nearly ran off the road because one man's judgment, however brilliant in the newsroom, was never enough to also police his own appetite for stone and gold leaf and Roman sarcophagi. The Vanderbilts lost their fortune because nobody was steering. Hearst nearly lost his because he refused to let anyone steer but himself, right up until the moment the law took the wheel by force. Two different roads, the same cliff, waiting at the bottom of both. He never did move back into the castle. He died in Beverly Hills in 1951 in a house borrowed from the woman who had spent her own fortune trying to save his, more than 200 miles from the hilltop where he had spent 3 decades and tens of millions of dollars building a home he could no longer afford to occupy freely. 7 years later, his family gave La Cuesta Encantada to the state of California, and it opened its doors not to presidents or movie stars, but to the public, a museum charging admission, the same fate that eventually caught up with Marjorie Post's Hillwood. The house that was built to prove one man's power to the world now earns its keep the only way any monument like it ever survives, by belonging to everyone and no one at all. William Randolph Hearst built a castle so large, so expensive, so relentlessly unfinished that in the end, even the man who built it could not afford to keep living inside it. And the machine that made the money did not fail because it was divided among careless heirs. It nearly failed because the one man who held every share of it could not bring himself to believe that a fortune, no matter how large, is not the same thing as a fortune that cannot run out. Is not the same thing as a fortune that cannot run out. The castle still stands on that hilltop today, and visitors still walk through the unfinished wing where the scaffolding was never taken down, because the state that inherited it saw no reason to finish what the man who built it never could. It is, in the end, the only monument in this story that tells the truth about itself. a palace forever under construction, built by a man who mistook motion for progress and never once stopped to ask if the machine underneath it was still running.